Thanks. For someone who spends so much time thinking and working about climate change, it took me a surprisingly long time to write this contribution. I think I was anxious to get this right because we're at such a crucial stage in the crisis. Thanks. And this isn't the usual crowd that I'm giving speeches to. From a personal perspective, before I begin, I see the world as glorious and full of splendor, and the more I learn about it as a scientist, the more I'm hurt by what we stand to lose. So thank you for the platform to talk about it today. When we talk about climate change, I'm used to arguing three things. The first is that climate change is real and happening at a rate that is unprecedented in either human history or the existence of the planet. The second is that climate change has significant material consequences for humanity and that life on Earth is being diminished as a result. And the third point is that we aren't doing enough, that our actions as a country are insufficient, and that Ireland is a climate laggard. I won't go into detail on these points because, as it stands, they're well established, and the question isn't of the challenge but how to address it. So I see climate change primarily as a political and social challenge. Not a technical one, because we have the technology to achieve carbon-neutral energy generation, and it's constantly being advanced. In terms of nature, climate change compounded by other human actions has produced a sixth mass extinction. However, over the 5 mass extinctions of the Earth's past, biodiversity has recovered and increased each time. To be crude, the world will recover after humanity is gone. That's not an excuse or to say that what we do now doesn't matter, but rather that our action in response to this crisis needs to prioritize the intersecting social impacts of a changing world. This includes famine, drought, floods, disease, mass migration, and subsequent border conflicts. So a practical example of this in an Irish context is that we will likely see increased climate migration into Ireland in coming years, which the impractical, expensive, and otherwise unethical system of direct provision won't have the capacity to absorb, especially given the current housing crisis. And there's already been violence and backlash from the anti-migrant far right towards this. The border security industry won't solve it. So you can see how complex these kind of questions are. In fact, the border security stand to make a lot of money. A lot of people stand to make a lot of money out of this crisis. One of the world's largest arms producers, Raytheon, have spoken out about the business opportunities that climate-related security concerns provide. Pre-existing social conflicts are exacerbated by climate change. For example, climate-induced drought from 2007 to 2010. Subsequent widespread crop failure and mass rural to urban migration are thought to have been contributing factors to the precipitation of revolution and civil war in Syria. So I'm just trying to give you a perspective of how this is going to actually materialize in society. It is the most vulnerable people in society at large who acutely feel these effects of climate change. The United Nations Human Rights Office of the Commissioner predicts that climate impacts may potentially undo 50 years of progress in development, global health, food security, and poverty reduction. They may also push an additional 120 million more people into poverty by 2030. In developing countries, the natural disasters induced by climate change cause a conservative estimate of 250,000 deaths a year. In the global north, we have been somewhat buffered from the worst by our wealth, but issues remain. John just wrote a huge list of them. So in Cork, my hometown, the city centre is increasingly flooding when the Lee bursts its banks due to higher tides because of rising sea levels. Storm Ophelia, the strongest eastern Atlantic storm in a century and a half, caused almost €70 million in damages to Ireland. Climate anxiety and depression are on the rise and are recognised by professional bodies such as the American Psychology Association. So that last point might seem obtuse, but studies have shown that climate change directly drives up both mental illness and suicide rates, and I have references for that. The advice which therapists give to patients with clinical anxiety is to intermittently return to places and thoughts of security, continuity, and safety. Young people feel they have no such things to return to. Where's the security in imminent social collapse? A recent report from the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions showed that young Irish women already have the highest rate of moderate to severe depression in the European Union. So maybe this is something we shouldn't ignore. My point is that we need to focus on now, the people that live in the world now. We must massively restructure our economy and energy infrastructure, but in a way that centres and supports the communities directly affected by this upheaval. The responses to climate change are mitigation and adaptation. And it is my opinion that mitigating human suffering should be the priority of climate action. Commitments have been made to this effect. In the Paris Agreement, there is a stated intention to support developing nations' transition to low-carbon or carbon-neutral economies through the transfer of technology and financial support. In the Climate Action Plan, there is a commitment to a just transition by which the employees and communities directly affected by the energy transition will be supported. But no national material support has materialised for developing nations to reduce emissions, and this month it was announced that 100 redundancies for ESB workers in Moneypoint Power Station are intended. 2 days ago in Longford, over 500 people protested the announcement that 72 people would be laid off at the Borden-Mona Mount Dillon plant. What are those communities supposed to do now? If I were a cynical person, which I am, I would say it seems as though Fine Gael are trying to pit farmers and energy workers against environmentalists to take the heat off them. I know it's naive to put weight behind governmental commitments, and if Irish politicians kept all their promises, we would certainly be living in utopia by now. But there you go. So the reception of Minister Bruton's Climate Action Plan is now largely unrelated to the material contained within the plan, because the issue isn't the content. The plan has flaws, but it's better than anything we've had before, with clear designation of responsibilities and deadlines across sectors. Denis Naughton's prior document was frankly just a waste of the paper that it was written on. So it has been good to have a minister who has experience in writing cross-sector plans, because it's something. The persisting issue is that, as a climate activist, you don't know where you stand because you can't trust anything. Mere days after launching the action plan, Minister Naughton squashed the Climate Emergency Measures Bill with a money message after it was passed through the door by a majority vote twice. This is after a recent FOI by Brian Stanley revealed government representatives met with oil and gas lobbyists more than 50 times in the last 2 years over new licenses to explore for and extract oil and gas off the southwest coast of Ireland. So, Fine Gael's pontificating about climate obviously is disingenuous, but their actions to block a bill voted in twice also seem borderline undemocratic. These licenses don't only lock us into fossil fuels, they're also damaging to marine ecology, interfere with fish catches, and fishing associations are not consulted. People are losing their jobs, households are going to be subjected to taxation to pay for multi-billion national fines for missing EU emission reduction targets. The financial burden per home could be greater than austerity. But private companies can still be granted licenses to explore and extract Irish oil and gas, contributing to the root cause of the issue. You can see why people are getting frustrated, striking, interrupting the minister's forestry talks, gluing themselves to the Department of Climate's building. And I'll just say as an aside, I think it's kind of funny that the bill was squashed because of a money message and how we don't have enough money, but our next panel is going to be on how we overrun costs on capital projects. So that's a bit ironic. This frustration is one feature in a broader landscape of years of vapid insincerity embedded in this country's politics. Environmental activists who push for and want to ban on fracking in the south are frustrated to witness fracking projects progress in the north without support and solidarity from the south. Activists who pushed Thomas Pringle's private member's bill to divest the country from fossil fuels thought they were witnessing a sea change, but instead have been met with stagnation. The environmental community celebrated when the government declared, with an uncharacteristic degree of self-awareness, that we're in the midst of a climate and biodiversity emergency, only for this to just seem to mean nothing. The current sentiment seems similar to that present during the Green Party's coalition in 2007 to 2011 and their disastrous and weak handling of the CARB gas project. The feeling is betrayal. All the right things were said at the time, but the worst possible scenario occurred. Here, too, the right things are being said, but who knows what will come to pass. The targets in Minister Bruton's action plan, which are insufficient, conveniently are for the closest deadline of 2030. Between this and the betrayal people feel over the housing crisis, Labour's party betrayal of the working class during Jobstown and the water charge protests, the education crisis, the healthcare crisis, and this broadening gap between the haves and the have-nots, it seems like the perfect recipe for populism, if the title of the week is Can the Centre Hold? Ireland seems to be less susceptible to populist movements than other Western countries for a whole host of possible reasons, like the church and post-colonial attitudes. I can't figure it out because I'm a scientist and not a sociologist. But if we were going to have a populist movement, it seems it would have been one that we would have had one post-crash. We can see that there's outrage, but I don't know how it will be manifested politically. it certainly won't be through mass apathy, because Irish people care about their country and the planet, as was demonstrated by the 10,000-strong school strike for climate in March. The Irish youth are politically engaged. We love a good protest. And yet, blind faith in the strikers and a younger generation to patch up this problem, because seeing how much they care gives you hope, is unproductive and at worst is downright insulting. Young people like Connell seem to be wheeled out for the sake of appearances in governmental proceedings, and then their legitimate concerns and recommendations are dismissed or ignored. Last week at the UN Conference on the Sustainable Development Goals in New York, an event on intergenerational dialogue on climate action was hosted by Ireland. The school strikers were not invited to participate, and when they were asked about the event, hadn't even been aware that it was taking place. So what sort of intergenerational dialogue is that? Young people and citizens in general actually can't dig us out of this hole if politicians don't take us seriously. I think young people are trying our best to build a better world, but keep coming up against performative politics from partisan politicians who don't really seem to have any values. This is initially confusing and ultimately dismaying. Through this process, a generation which is utterly disillusioned with established politics is being produced. People of power with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo need to consider whether this represents a threat to them. As a country, we need to get our attitude right to this problem. Although it's a massive challenge we should have started confronting a long time ago, and individuals feel powerless, despair is a luxury which we cannot afford. We need to be pragmatic and work quickly and work hard to invest in renewables and follow the guidance of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action, which the Dáil has voted to accept and endorse. We can't do that if politicians aren't honest and keep lying. In response to the question, how will Ireland meet the challenge, I think we need to start by telling the truth. I'll finish with a quote by the writer Arundhati Roy. This is a popular one at protests as well. She writes, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." I think people need to ask themselves where they want to be standing when that world arrives. Thank you.